Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode. I'm super excited that you're back. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for liking. Thank you for sharing the episodes. It means the world to us. So keep doing that. We're getting ready for another season. And with this episode, I'm excited to bring our first poet to the podcast, someone who I met recently at the Texas Book Festival. We got to chat a little bit. We got to see each other at the different mixers, got to check out her work, which, I'll admit, I love poetry, but I could never. I don't know the mechanics. I love it. It feels like poetry finds me at the right time in my life, and I can't wait to talk to our next guest. So our next guest, Sara Daniele Rivera, is Cuban Peruvian American artist, writer, translator, and educator. She has written so many stuff that you can find out there. Most recently, her debut book of poetry, The Blue Mimes, through Graywolf Press 2024, won the 2023 Academy of American Poets First Book Award. She's coming live to us from Albuquerque, New Mexico. Sara, what's up?
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for taking time to hang out. We got to meet in Austin, and I thought it was like super cool to get to meet you and learn more about your work. What made you get into poetry?
I feel like poetry was. I feel like as a kid you get poetry, right? So I feel like as a kid I loved poems. I loved the sound and the music of poems. I feel like that's one of the first things we respond to as kids. And the thing I distinctly remember was that I was like 10 years old, and I was reading Lemony Snicket's The Series of Unfortunate Events.
Uh-huh.
And there's an excerpt from an Algernon Charles Swinburne poem in one of them, from his poem, The Garden of Proserpine. And I got obsessed with that poem, and I went and I memorized it. It's really long. I don't have it memorized anymore, but I got obsessed with it, with the cadence and the meter. And then for years after that, I was like a kid writing these kind of metered poems, copying, what I heard. And then it was something that always stayed with me, even as I started to, not write in copycat meters anymore.
Yeah, I feel like poetry is definitely something that I can definitely tell you that I gravitated towards poetry as like a kid. And you're right. It's like I think kids have like it's short. They may or may not rhyme. They have a message. And they definitely invoke emotion. And I think you either stick with it, or for me, it's like, like I was saying in the intro, it's like I feel like poetry definitely finds me when I need to see the right passage, the right poem, the right something. And it's like, I feel like poetry definitely helps make sense of this silly world sometimes,
Yeah.
Because poetry definitely comes from like, there's a lot of emotion. There's a lot of emotion. I think poetry spawns from a place of wanting to communicate that. Was that the case for you from the early on?
Yeah, I think so. And I think sometimes we get poetry taught out of us in schools here in the US. Sometimes we're only taught poems by old dead white writers. Sometimes we are taught poems as like a series of analytical tools we have to deconstruct rather than something that we feel. So we kind of lose that first contact or that first connection that we're supposed to have, which is that we're supposed to feel it, even if we don't logically understand the mechanics or what the poet is trying to do. And I'm glad that I didn't lose that, because I feel like a lot of people do. And, that's a testament to like the teachers I had and the other readers I had in my life who always made poetry something very living and current.
From when you are like where you are now as a poet, as an author, to when you first started your academic work, higher education, like at a university,
Mhm.
what is the big takeaway now? Like, what is the misconception that you had when you started kind of pursuing poetry at this high level to where you are now? Because you teach it, you're published in so many outlets. It's like you are an expert in what you do now. So what was the misconception you had early on?
Well, I went into undergrad I was a studio art major. I ended up doing studio art and English when I graduated. Um, and I entered more as a fiction writer, even though I always wrote poetry. And then I had poet mentors who kind of like guided me towards poetry. And told me that I could get an MFA and led me in that direction and everything. And I don't know if I had any misconceptions. I think I knew very little about the different ways to be a poet in the world today, because there are a lot of different ways to have a career in writing, and there are a lot of different ways that people put together their careers. And I just had no notion of really what I would
Yeah.
do when I finished studying, or how I would actually make this thing into a career. So I think there were some stumbling moments where I had to kind of figure that out and construct that over time for myself. And I certainly think even in MFA programs, we don't always give writers a lot of guidance around, what is your life going to look like, and what like position is kind of your writing practice going to hold in your professional life. So I think there was just a lot I didn't know.
Yeah, that is interesting that you say that, because I think oftentimes, we're talking about an MFA, like in the creative field, but most times I think, you know, people get into, you know, pursuing a graduate degree and, you know, even doctors, but you're so enamored with the subject matter that, sometimes we don't think about what that's going to look like afterwards. And that's true. It's like, I think programs could definitely incorporate more of that. It's like, what is this going to look like afterwards?
Yeah, well, there are fields like that have a clear trajectory, right, of what you generally do after you study. And the arts aren't like that. And that's a really kind of magical thing about the arts. And it can also be a really difficult thing about the arts as you're trying to, start a career. And I think the other thing I thought, um, I thought coming out of my MFA that I had my first book, right? Because you work
Right.
on a book for your thesis. And it became clear to me really quickly that that was not going to be a book, and that I just needed time like in the world. And it ended up being 9 years before I finished a first book. So I
Wow.
think if I could go back to that point, I would tell myself that this is going to take the time it needs to take.
Mhm.
And you're not going to just have a book coming out of your MFA program because you wrote a thesis. Some
That's
people do, but I didn't.
But that's interesting. I think some people think that MFA, even though it's not a quick thing, but it could be serving as some kind of fast track to getting the right people to review your first book and this kind of thing. And then you're like, I'm going to go sell this thing right after. And it's kind of like, oh, use that money, pay this. Like it seems it doesn't work that way in art. It's not
Yeah.
an MBA, where you can hit the ground running.
Yeah.
But that's interesting. I think there's a lot of people. I have friends who went the MFA route, and they're like, "Oh, I'll probably have a book, when the time is like when I graduate from the program." And sure, that may be the case for some, but not always.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a place where you learn some of those skills, right? Like putting things together into collection, or you gain some valuable networking, and you grow a lot in your craft, but it's not necessarily the place where you're going to write, the work that you're really meant to or want to write.
Right. It's do you find like when you're out teaching, it's like when you encounter a young like a student and you're teaching poetry, what is that point that you're meeting them at? Is like are you finding that kids are more and more into poetry, longer? Because we were talking about it kind of goes away. Do you find that poetry sticks with students longer?
Well, it's interesting. I've taught in so many different contexts, especially talking about young people. I've worked with youth writers in a lot of different contexts, right? Like I've worked with youth writers in a program called the Grub Street Young Adult Writers Fellowship Program. And those are like advanced writers who applied to, have this paid position doing writing with us. And so there are a lot of like super advanced poets who are teenagers, poets who know their influences and who read a lot of contemporary work and who have maybe done slams or have, just like written a huge body of work. And I'm always so incredibly impressed by those teens, even the ones who write everything on their phones, maybe like especially the ones who write everything on their phones. But then I've also worked with youth in other contexts where I'm doing writing workshops with young people who don't consider themselves writers or who have never actually explored writing. And I think that there are a lot of poetic exercises and poetic tools that can actually be a gateway to somebody telling their story for the first time. Whether it's something like repetition, right? That if I'm, building a sentence using the same construction and I'm seeing how it changes as it repeats, maybe that structure can kind of unlock something for a kid. So I've seen the full range of like kids who have way more knowledge of poetry than I ever did. Probably also because they live in this age where information is so accessible and it's so easy for them to, get writing education and find out what poets are writing right now, or to see poetic performances on TikTok or YouTube, whatever, to kids who really have no notion of it. So I think that spectrum has probably always existed, and it maybe just looks different now.
And maybe even process, like one of the things that stuck out to me, you said was, students who write, young poets who write their poems on their phone. It's like, I think, as you were coming up, there was a conducive way of writing poetry, and you did it a certain way, and phones weren't really like a thing. It's like, I think when I look, I'm, being a stand-up comedian, when I see even myself now, it's like I jot down notes. It's like before, it's like you had to carry the little notebook, which I did for years, but then the phone I always had with me. So that's where I tend to jot down. So I think even in process, things have changed so much, and you want to meet students where they're at.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, do you feel that has like changed poetry in a sense, like the technology of it all?
Probably. I mean, it's probably changed poetry in ways that I haven't even, that I'm not even aware of yet. I'm sure. I mean, you and I, when we first met, talked a little bit about, social media and writing. And I know that Instagram poetry and the idea of fragments of text that can be ingested so quickly when we're doing all of this social media scrolling, like that has changed the landscape of poetry quite a bit. Those are poets who can now get book deals, and that is a way that people are encountering poetry. And, that can have its positives in that people can feel like poetry is accessible to them, and it can have its negatives in terms of just, there are a lot of different ways in which it kind of alters the landscape of reading and writing. But, I'm always a little wary of how short our attention spans are getting and what that might do to like kind of the critical process of craft. But I'm also happy when people are reading poetry. So it's
100%. I think, I definitely remember this conversation, and it was, it's like, I was so curious. Again, it's like poetry is something I truly love. I want to know more about it. I could never, it's like I think it's reserved for a special kind of person that could process and communicate their ideas through this structure, but I kept thinking, like, I kept comparing it to stand-up comedy, and I said, in our conversation, I remember, telling Sarah that the clips, the reels did so much for stand-up comedies. Like, one, I'm great more people are checking out stand-up, and I think it made it accessible to more people. Like, back in my day, if I wanted to watch stand-up, I had to go to the library, check out a DVD, or go to Sam Goody or Warehouse Music and buy a $20 DVD. And it's like, that's no more. It's like, or if you had cable, you can watch HBO specials, which I grew up with no cable, so I had to save my money up to go buy a DVD or a VHS. And now with the advent of, for better or for worse, it's like it changes the game, because it's like the name of the game now is like this quick form. Not that one-liner comedy wasn't a thing, but it's like these clips definitely dictate how you move on stage, how like, people have found great success through this kind of shorter form clips, 30 seconds of comedy thing. So, that's what drew me to, having that conversation to you, because it's like, sure, poetry is, I guess, shorter, but it's part of a bigger thing. It's not just one droplet of poetry. It's like you have to read it in the context of the whole thing.
Yeah. And not every poem, is that either. Not every poem is these kind of quick digestible fragments. And not every poem is like best enjoyed that way. But, at the same time, when Nikki Giovanni just passed away, everyone was sharing her poems all over social media, and I came to revisit some of her books, but it was also kind of nice to stumble across these poems throughout my day kind of unexpectedly and spend a little time with them. So yeah, for better or for worse, writing is always changing, the arts are always changing, and technology is a big part of that.
Right.
So
yeah, it's like and then another thing too that you just said is like spending time with it. I think, poetry is something you spend time with. It's like a book, you spend time with it reading it, but it's like, because it's so short, you almost have to reread it. You're able to reread it. You're encouraged or motivated to reread it because it's so short, but at the same time, it's so like dense, and like it's so packed with so much meaning. Like, yeah, kudos to you. And what was it like to get your first piece out there? I'm sure that was super tough. Like, do you remember the first piece you got published?
The first poem?
Yeah.
Yeah, the first poem I got published was with an online journal called Dialogist. They're really cool. They put like audio recordings of the poems with the pieces, and they just have a very like simple interface. So you just see like one poem laid out really beautifully on the page. And it was a poem I wrote in my grad program called Baltic Sea, which was about being with my two sisters, my sisters and my cousin. She's always mad that she's not in the poem, but she was there. So I was with my sisters and my cousin by the Baltic Sea, and wrote this poem for this moment for us, kind of the first time you're with your siblings alone as an adult almost. And it felt huge for me. It felt really special. And it was a really special piece for me too at the time.
Mm-hmm. Do you ever like when you write a piece, and then because you said this particular place does an audio recording, do you ever like go, the poem is different once you read it than when you write it, because it's here. Do you have a preference? Like, is there certain poems you're like, I only wrote this, I never said it out loud, and then when you hear it, you're like, oh, that's different?
Not really, because I always read out loud constantly as I write. Yeah. And I think it's a really important part of the process. I mean, it's not part of every poet's process, but I try to get my students to do it because I feel like poetry is very much about sound. It has an oral quality as well as a written quality. And at the very least, if you want to share your poems, you're going to be asked to read them, right? And so you
Right.
should be sort of cognizant of how it sounds in the voice. But also, you experience the poem differently when you hear it than when you see it written or are writing it. There are things you hear that you don't pick up on when the text is in front of you. So I think it's really valuable. I like with students having them read their piece and then having someone else read their piece so they can kind of hear it in someone else's voice too. And yeah, that's constant for me.
That's so cool. Is there any subjects, any themes that seem to be like one of the recurring motifs of this season, with all the authors, illustrators, that we've dived into is like has been, grief in one way or another, and it seems like you do a very not seems you do a very good job of balancing this kind of complex idea with some of your stuff, when you talk about grief. And it's not an easy thing to do because it could evoke emotion on both ends. Grief can also invoke this very positive, overwhelming feeling, but also on the other end where it makes you sit with this kind of heaviness. It's like, can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I wrote this book, like I mentioned, over the course of 9 years, and they were years where I lost a lot of people close to me. I lost my grandmothers during the pandemic. I lost some friends unexpectedly, and I lost my dad in 2017. And a lot of the book is dedicated to him. And they were also years of this kind of these moments of public and social and global grief as well. They were the years of the pandemic. They were years of mass shooting and sort of this country also reckoning with racial violence in a different way than it ever had before. And so I think I was balancing a lot of this personal grief and this kind of larger grief that I felt like I was a part of. That personal and public, is also the year that Trump first got elected, and there was a lot of grief in that, especially for Latina communities. And so I wrote those years to, in some ways, like I didn't know I was writing this book because in a lot of ways I was just writing to process those losses and to get myself through some of the lowest moments, especially the years after I lost my dad. So I didn't really know what would come out of it. And when I was putting the book together, I worried. I was like, is this too heavy? Is there no light in this? Because I felt like I wrote it from a lot of lightless places. But when I've shared the book now with people, it seems like readers identify quite a lot of light and hope and love in it. And I think that's also kind of inherently part of getting through grief, part of, remembering and holding the people we've lost. There is inherently love and light in that, grieving what's happening in a country, what's happening to people and communities you care about. It's because you have a desire to advocate for and fight for and love on those communities. So, yeah.
Yeah, it has to be like 9 years of collecting poems. It's like I we talked with someone who wrote a memoir this season, and I kept thinking it's like when they write a memoir, like it's a collection of stories, and but when you're writing a book like the one that you put together over 9 years, it's like you have a lot of poems, and often think, I'm like, I wonder if it's anything like a musician recording song after song, and then they have to figure out what's going to make the album. What is your process in selecting what poems are going to come together? Because you're exploring this emotion of grief and this kind of thing. So, yeah, what is your selection process? Like, what ends up on the floor?
Well, I think it was maybe like 4 years in, 5 years in, that I started to feel like maybe I had a book. Like I had written a bunch of poems, and the title poem of the book is kind of the poem that I saw as like the catalyst for everything. Like once that came together as a poem, I kind of saw these other poems I was writing or these other things I was thinking about. They felt related to that piece or to the themes that were in that piece, which, it had to do with grief and translation and this kind of strange belonging and unbelonging that I felt when I went back to Peru for the first time since childhood. And it had this like fluidity of language that I was just starting to unlock between English and Spanish. So, other poems started to feel interconnected, and I just kind of start to group poems. If you're submitting poems places, sometimes you also start to do that because you start to create kind of like submission packets and you start to see how poems resonate together. And I find the beginning stages of that very exciting and fun.
Yeah.
And then I was kind of pushed. I was solicited a few years ago by a press that didn't end up taking the book, but they they asked if I had a collection, and that kind of pushed me to look at everything I had collected and start to create an arc in a manuscript. Mm-hmm. And even that version of the book is very different from what I ended up with. There were poems that ultimately got cut. There were poems that got added. There were the structure and kind of organization of the poems changed a great deal, even in my editing process with Graywolf. But that initial, like, it's almost like putting together a mixtape sometimes of seeing like how one poem like ends and how the next one starts and how they start to have conversations with each other. It's super fun. I really like that part.
Yeah, it's like in stand-up comedy, we work on the hour special. It's like the traditional way of stand-up comedy. You spent years trying to put this, hour special together, but along the way, during the course of you putting an hour special, sometimes you get a, what's called a late night set. Something you would see on the Tonight Show, that kind of thing. So, those are usually 5 minutes. So sometimes in the development of a new hour, sometimes you get opportunities to do a set. So now you're taking 5 minutes out of this structure and putting it over here, and it kind of makes this a little wonky. You're like, oh no, like I just burned 5 minutes. And it sounds like that happened to you, right? You submitted some of the poems. Did that in turn added more years to end up at 9 years before you put it out? Do you think you could have put it out in 7 years, 8 years, if you hadn't submitted some of these poems?
No, I don't think so. I'm glad that I spent time submitting the poems, because I think if I'd always been focused on the book, and certainly that can like loom in your mind, the way like you're funneling everything towards that 1 hour special, you can get into a place where you're funneling everything into the book. But sometimes like that can take you away from the individual poems, or at least this is, how my process works. I think that submitting the poems I'm working on encourages me to spend a lot of time with them, to polish them, to figure out what each poem really is on its own and what it is in conversation with like a few other pieces. And that is, for me, only valuable to the kind of larger book they're eventually going to be part of. And it's, getting pieces published in journals and everything isn't a requirement for getting your first book or chapbook or anything out. And people, can kind of dedicate a different amount of energy to that process, whatever works for them. I'm not like a monster submitter. I don't submit like tons and tons of stuff. I just submit kind of a handful of pieces to places I really like. But that's how you start interacting with readers and how you start like connecting with folks over your poetry before you have a book to show, which is really important, I think.
And it's I love it. I love sitting in front of a yellow legal pad with a G2 Pilot pen, point one. It's the joy. It's the joy of sitting down and writing and sitting with the words. It's like when I craft a new joke or I'm dealing with a new premise. The process for a stand-up comic is different, which you don't know it's funny until you bring it to the stage. And it's often hard to even do that. And before that, sometimes there's, mentors who I'm very lucky to work with and be able to, talk to them about jokes. And I have a select few. What does that process look like for a poet? Is there an editor at the press that kind of looks at your work? Is there someone you trust to be like, hey, can you look over these things? It's like, what does that look like? Like the editing process after you've committed to a poem before it becomes like a book.
So I think there's what that looks like as you're putting together a book, and then there's the editorial process once you've gotten a book accepted. And in my experience, those have been like very different things and very different kind of stages of the polishing journey. For me, when I've got like a set of poems and I want to know how they're working, I have readers who I send them to. I've got a few poet friends who are just phenomenal readers. And, over your writing life, you meet a lot of different writers. You meet a lot of writers who are good readers, but I encourage my students to really hang on to the people who are great readers for your work and who are great, like, writing friends too. If you can have friends who are good readers, that's like one of the most incredible things. So I always share poems with a few poet friends who I really respect and who I know are going to help me see something in the poem that maybe I can't see on my own. And that tends to be kind of alongside just my own editing and reworking and revision. That's kind of what I do. And then once I had the book, this was kind of my first experience of working closely with an editor on my own poems, my editor at Graywolf, Chance, who really just an incredible editor, helped me change and loosen and experiment with the structure of the book too much, kind of eradicated these really tidy sections I had and made it much more dynamic and, things like taking two poems that I thought were paired together because they were like sister poems in my mind, and they echoed each other and saying, well, what if one's at the beginning and one's at the end of the book? And you have kind of this space in between these two echoes. That was all really incredible for me to think about. And he also pointed out things like that I use the word stars too much. Just I'm going to flag every time you say it in 3 poems next to each other. And then you're mortified. It's helpful.
On that note, is what was there any piece of feedback, either, working with Chance or with anyone else that was maybe a little hard to kind of soak in and there's oftentimes it's brings up questions of do I speak up? Pick your battles kind of thing. You hear writers and even illustrators that we've talked to so far on this season of like knowing when to speak up or like, because the idea is always that you have a team working together to make the best work possible. Everyone's invested in making it the best book possible. So, but sometimes it's like learning to speak up. It's like, this joke is necessary, or I want it to be this. Did you encounter any friction in past pieces or even in this book?
I feel like I have in the past much more than now. I feel like in grad school, sometimes I would wrestle with that because and it took time for me to realize that it's because I was writing what I thought the program wanted and not, actually writing what I needed and wanted to write. And sometimes I would get feedback that was like, this doesn't make sense, or this doesn't have like kind of a core or heart or a center that I'm really holding on to. And that could be hard because you're in this MFA program, you're trying to like be an important writer person. And, it can be tough, especially because I did that program so young. I think I had a lot of moments where I felt like very down because I didn't get good feedback on something. But then I had a lot of moments after that where I was like, oh, they were right,
Right.
And I had to shift my approach and shift the way in what I was writing and just like allow more of my thought, my voice and everything into the work. With this collection, I don't feel like I had that a lot because I feel like by the time I published it, I knew the pieces well enough. When I would I think the hardest thing was poems that I had liked in their form for a long time and that I had read them aloud a lot and they were published a certain way. And Chance would say, like, I don't really know what these lines are saying, or, this doesn't really make sense, or maybe this isn't the right word, or what if you change these lines? And those were poems where I was really resistant to that. But sometimes he was right. And so I had a few times where I did allow some changes, and then sometimes where he recommended changes and I just knew the poem well enough to be like, no, that's not what I'm going for in this moment. Like I'm going to stick to the way it is. And a good editor will be responsive to both those things and really welcoming of both those things.
But what a delicate dance, right? Is like between editor and the person turning in the works. It's like, kudos to Chance. It sounds like Chance really understood where you were coming from. And again, best intentions are assumed, but sometimes you feel like it's tough. It's our art. It's our baby. So it's very hard to, we always take the constructive criticism, but at times it's like, one of the guests earlier in this season said is like, you got to put your ego in a box and put it away, which is true. But then it's like, sometimes you unlock it a little bit to not so much ego, but to be able to, a very shy kid in the back of, actually, I feel a certain way. And I think I was, dealt I was able to work with a phenomenal editor, Maria Russo. And man, I can't tell you, like, that chemistry is so important because there's a lot of revisions going back and forth and you have to be open to some ideas. And man, I was so pleasantly surprised and so grateful that I got to work with Maria Russo. And it sounds like Chance was that person for you. Also, great name, Chance. It's like, hey, give me a chance.
Yeah, Chance to Roland. Yeah, absolutely incredible. And, as we're talking about it, I think that one of the things I've grown into over time is when I have a really strong reaction to a piece of feedback, I try to just sit with it for a bit. Like I try to not make any changes immediately when I'm like feeling emotional about it. And I try to sit with like, am I having this reaction because I'm feeling defensive about the work, because I don't want to hear what this person is saying because I'm so attached to it? Or am I having this reaction because I feel like, like maybe this is not the reader or not the audience for my work, and like they're just not receiving it well. So I always try to sit with it and be like, is it me or is it you?
Right.
Where are we at?
And it goes back to something you said, just a little while ago, but it's like when you said, am I writing this because you thought that that's what the MFA program was looking for? It's like, there's also feelings of that. It's like, once you get, you're working on a book together, it's like you get to know Chance and what, he or she may like or not like as an editor. And then you start to wonder, is like, am I writing this because I know I'm going to like, is this what they're looking for? Or am I like not paying attention to this want of wanting to express and just making a mistake? I have an editor, trusting the editor. So it's funny. It's like, knowing where the ideas are coming from is key.
Yeah. And I don't know, because I've never written a book for contract, which some of my friends have done, writing towards like what somebody has given you a contract to write. So I imagine that must be even trickier,
Right.
in moments like that. But certainly I think when you get stuck writing towards what someone else wants, like people can see through that. One of my mentors in my grad program was the poet Louise Glick, and she could just like see through the bullshit and eviscerate it,
It's like, no, I'm going to be the one to put one past it. It's like, no, they can pick up on it.
She would just eviscerate it. And I was like, but the second I wrote something, like I started to just show her like my weirdest stuff that I didn't even think I'd show anyone, because it was just stuff I felt like I was writing for me. And she was like, yeah, this is the stuff,
Nice.
So yeah, people can see through that.
But that's also a testament to her that Louise made you feel so comfortable that you were able to bring out the weirdest stuff, which is sometimes like, I don't know, but it ends up being the closest thing to your voice, especially at that time where you're still learning and discovering yourself. It's like, oh, these are the glimpses you need to like find your actual voice.
Yeah, hold on to the weird stuff.
Hold on to the weird
You're
stuff.
like a young writer, like hold on to the weirdest stuff.
That I feel is like a title of an amazing book, is hold on to the weird stuff. There's something to be said about it, because I think that's ultimately what's remembered, the weird stuff. It's like, this was great. Sometimes the weirdest jokes are like, hey, remember this weird joke? I'm like, oh yeah, you like that one? What about the one I spent like years trying to perfect the words? No, I like the weird one. Okay. Yeah.
I like the one that just feels like the weirdest corners of your brain.
Right. Do you have any advice for young poets wanting to get their first work published in a magazine or working on their first poetry book? What are the top 3 pieces of advice you would give a young poet?
I think that the first one is to allow things to take the time they need to take. I think that that's true of collections. I think that that's true of individual poems. I think it can feel, especially when you're like in your 20s, it can feel like such a rat race that, oh, people around me are getting books. People around me have a ton of publications or are getting fellowships or are on these young emerging writer lists. And I don't have that, so I'm behind. And I really think that's completely detrimental to the creative process. And there's just no point. If we get swept up in that, then we're always operating in this place of competition. So I would say to, let things take the time they need to take. I'm also really big into community over competition. Like, I think that as you find people who are your writing community and you find people who are going to uplift you and you're excited to uplift them rather than pitting yourselves against each other, like that's a lot of writing and a lot of opportunity and a lot of connection is going to come from that, just like find your people in this very like potentially solitary and isolating endeavor of writing. And then I like the last thing. I like the keep your weird stuff. I keep everything, you know. I encourage my students to keep everything. You never know when maybe you want to go back and make like a collage poem or an erasure of the dead fragments of poems from 10 years ago. You know, maybe you want to kind of use your writing to revisit your past self. So, especially with like teens too, I encourage people to like, you know, find what makes them weird as people and hold on to that and put that in their writing. And
I think those are great. You know, time, let it take the time that it needs. I mean, you even said at 4 years into it, you knew you had the book, but it took an additional few more years until year 9 that you're like, I'm ready. Community. I think, you know, community is so important. You know, it's what keeps you going. It's what props you back up when you hit the ground, and you know, the community itself, you know, makes it a point to make sure that you're not on the ground too long. You know, it's like get back up and get writing, get to the weird stuff, which is a great third one. You know, we are winding down here, and you know, before we go, I definitely want to ask about the cover. I think the cover it complements your work, and I think it's like visually, it's like I always say this. It's like I think pictures is the first thing that gets us to start reading as young readers. It's what gets you to the book, and it's important. You know, it invokes the emotion that you're trying to do before they get to actually reading it. So, walk us through the cover to your latest book, The Blue Mime.
Yeah, it was designed by Mary Austin Speaker, who is incredible, and I am more and more enamored with this cover over time, which I think is part of the, like, I think, you know, you have a good cover when you're like continuously kind of growing with the cover and finding new ways to appreciate it. The book contains line drawings by some by me and some by my dad, which were kind of always part of the book. And over the years, over really the process of like writing about the book for copy and describing it to people, I sort of started to understand how these drawings, this method of drawing that my dad taught me that was very searching, these images that were in motion and very incomplete, how that resonated with the themes of the book. And those images in particular are in one of the poems. It's called Semillas de Lucuma Seeds. And it was on the trip where the book started, when I went back to Peru in 2014 after my grandfather passed away. It was a really difficult trip. Like, he had passed away. My grandmother had very advanced Alzheimer's. I was sort of re-experiencing this country, but spending most of the hours every day in my mother's childhood house, and like re-experiencing the country through the lens of that house. And it was just like a very kind of lonely and difficult and slow-paced time. But I collected these seeds from the lucuma fruit, which was my grandmother's favorite fruit. And they were like glassine and beautiful, like little objects. And so I was drawing these seeds just as kind of a meditation for myself. And Mary thought to put them on the cover of the book. And the fact that they started when the book started, and they were this kind of archive, and they are these line drawings, and also that they are kind of ambiguous and amorphous. You don't know what they are right away.
Initially, you have like this feeling of like, is the middle one a seashell, and then the other ones it's almost like, it's like this. There's a lot of movement. I also love the choice of color, right? Because it's subtle, but yet it pops out with this kind of very light manila color to it.
They asked, what do you not want? And I was like, well, I don't want it to be like blue, you know? I don't want mega blue with the title, The Blue Mimes.
But yeah, it's so good. We've been popping it up here on the screen. It truly is so good. Can we pop it up one more time? Take a look at it. I want people to look at it. It's so good. The font also is like perfect, and the fact that it's like blue with the word blue. Like I obsess over these things. If you can't tell, I think it's great. I think the green in the bottom left-hand corner is what pops and directs the eyes to the rest of it.
Yeah.
I'm the type of guy who goes to a museum and spends like all 8 hours at the museum's open, where like people in the museum start following me around. Are you all right, man? Yeah, just checking out the art. So I love your cover. I love your book. I love the way you express yourself. I mean, poetry is very complex. I love it. And it's I'm really happy we were able to connect. I hope we're able to connect again, and kudos to you. I can't wait to see what else is in the pipeline. And go check out her book, The Blue Mimes. Go wherever you buy books, go get it. Thank you again so much for your time.
Thank you, Jesus.
Thank you. And that's it, you guys. Thank you. That's another episode of the Jesus Trejo podcast. What a great episode. This was a real treat. Keep watching, like and subscribe, reach out to her. We have her socials here at the bottom. We're going to list everything down so you can go check out her website, go check out her new book. Thank you again. We'll see you next time. Peace.